Welcome, fellow wanderer of the shadow between worlds, to a story about inheritance and the weight of blood, about what it means to be born from two irreconcilable legacies and to spend a life deciding which one to carry forward. Tonight we trace the entire story of Damian Wayne, son of the Batman and grandson of the Demon's Head, a child who was designed before he was conceived and loved before he was understood. So settle in, let the cave's quiet darkness find you, and allow yourself to drift as we follow one extraordinary life from its extraordinary beginning toward the person it has been becoming ever since. Every story has a before, a period of causes that precede the effects the story is actually about, a gathering of conditions that makes the central event not just possible, but inevitable in the specific form it takes. Damian Wayne's story has a before that is larger and stranger and more consequential than most, because the forces that produced him were not the ordinary forces that produce ordinary children, not the simple convergence of two people who found each other and decided, consciously or accidentally, to add another person to the world. The forces that produced Damian Wayne were ancient and deliberate, and organized around a vision of human civilization so comprehensive and so ruthless that the production of a child was merely one instrument among many in its pursuit. Ra's al Ghul had been alive for a very long time, by means that the ordinary biology of human existence did not provide, and that the Lazarus pits did, and the length of his life had produced in him the specific quality of perspective that belongs exclusively to people who have watched enough history to understand its patterns from the inside, rather than observing them from the impassive outside. He had watched civilizations rise and collapse with the patience of someone who had no particular reason to expect that his own observation would end before the pattern completed itself again. He had watched the specific mechanisms of collapse, the corruption, the resource depletion, the moral deterioration, the institutional failures that always preceded the end of any organized human enterprise by enough time that someone paying careful attention could have intervened. If someone paying careful attention had possessed both the will and the capability to do so, he had developed from this watching a philosophy that was coherent within its own terms and catastrophic in its implications, that humanity was a patient requiring correction by forces sufficiently powerful and sufficiently unconstrained by ordinary moral consideration to apply the correction comprehensively. He was not, in his own understanding of himself, a destroyer. He was a physician who had watched the patient ignore every available treatment for long enough that more drastic intervention had become the only remaining option, and who had accepted that his role required him to be willing to administer treatments that the patient would not choose voluntarily and would not survive in their present form. The distinction between physician and destroyer in Ra's al Ghul's philosophy was a distinction of intent rather than method, and he held to it with the absolute conviction of someone who had spent centuries developing the justification. He had also understood something about succession that most leaders never had sufficient time to fully comprehend. The continuation of a mission that transcended any individual life required not just institutional structure, but personal lineage, heirs who shared not just the mission's objectives, but the specific quality of mind and capability that made those objectives pursuable. He had produced Talia, and Talia had inherited qualities from both her parents that made her extraordinary in the specific ways the League's mission required. But Ra's al Ghul's ambition was not satisfied by adequate successes when exceptional ones remained theoretically achievable. He had identified Bruce Wayne as the detective, the man whose capability and whose commitment and whose specific quality of moral seriousness placed him in a category that Ra's al Ghul's long experience had not previously encountered in anyone he had not personally trained. The identification was not merely professional admiration, though it was that, too. It was the recognition of a man who had built himself into something extraordinary through the same quality of total commitment that Ra's al Ghul had always demanded from the League's finest, but who had directed that commitment toward ends that Ra's found simultaneously admirable and insufficient. He could not simply recruit the detective. He had tried, repeatedly, and the detective had declined, repeatedly, with the entire story of Damian Wayne, full Batman lore. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the shadow between worlds, to a story about inheritance and the weight of blood, about what it means to be born from two irreconcilable legacies, and to spend a life deciding which one to carry forward. Tonight we trace the entire story of Damian Wayne, son of the Batman and grandson of the Demon's Head, a child who was designed before he was conceived and loved before he was understood. So settle in, let the cave's quiet darkness find you, and allow yourself to drift as we follow one extraordinary life from its extraordinary beginning toward the person it has been becoming ever since. Every story has a before, a period of causes that precede the effects the story is actually about, a gathering of conditions that makes the central event not just possible, but inevitable in the specific form it takes. Damian Wayne's story has a before that is larger and stranger and more consequential than most, because the forces that produced him were not the ordinary forces that produce ordinary children, not the simple convergence of two people who found each other and decided, consciously or accidentally, to add another person to the world. The forces that produced Damian Wayne were ancient and deliberate and organized around a vision of human civilization so comprehensive and so ruthless that the production of a child was merely one instrument among many in its pursuit. Ra's al Ghul had been alive for a very long time, by means that the ordinary biology of human existence did not provide, and that the Lazarus pits did, and the length of his life had produced in him the specific quality of perspective that belongs exclusively to people who have watched enough history to understand its patterns from the inside, rather than observing them from the outside. He had watched civilizations rise and collapse with the patience of someone who had no particular reason to expect that his own observation would end before the pattern completed itself again. He had watched the specific mechanisms of collapse, the corruption, the resource depletion, the moral deterioration, the institutional failures that always preceded the end of any organized human enterprise, by enough time that someone paying careful attention could have intervened. If someone paying careful attention had possessed both the will and the capability to do so, he had developed from this, watching a philosophy that was coherent within its own terms and catastrophic in its implications, that humanity was a patient, requiring correction by forces sufficiently powerful and sufficiently unconstrained by ordinary moral consideration to apply the correction comprehensively. He was not, in his own understanding of himself, a destroyer. He was a physician who had watched the patient ignore every available treatment for long enough that more drastic intervention had become the only remaining option, and who had accepted that his role required him to be willing to administer treatments that the patient would not choose voluntarily and would not survive in their present form. The distinction between physician and destroyer in Ra's al Ghul's philosophy was a distinction of intent rather than method, and he held to it with the absolute conviction of someone who had spent centuries developing the justification. He had also understood something about succession that most leaders never had sufficient time to fully comprehend. The continuation of a mission that transcended any individual life required not just institutional structure, but personal lineage, heirs who shared not just the mission's objectives, but the specific quality of mind and capability that made those objectives pursuable. He had produced Talia, and Talia had inherited qualities from both her parents that made her extraordinary in the specific ways the League's mission required. But Ra's al Ghul's ambition was not satisfied by adequate successors when exceptional ones remained theoretically achievable. He had identified Bruce Wayne as the detective, The man whose capability and whose commitment and whose specific quality of moral seriousness placed him in a category that Ra's al Ghul's long experience had not previously encountered in anyone he had not personally trained. The identification was not merely professional admiration, though it was that too. It was the recognition of a man who had built himself into something extraordinary through the same quality of total commitment that Ra's al Ghul had always demanded from the League's finest, but who had directed that commitment toward ends that Ra's found simultaneously admirable and insufficient. He could not simply recruit the detective. He had tried repeatedly, and the detective had declined repeatedly, with the specific consistency of someone whose values were not negotiable positions to be revised through persuasion or pressure, but foundational commitments around which everything else was organized. What he could do was ensure that the detective's qualities continued. The genetic material that had produced someone capable of matching the League's finest on the League's own terms, combined with the bloodline that had sustained the League across centuries of deliberate cultivation. This combination, shaped from its earliest developmental moment by the League's methods and the League's vision, would produce an heir beyond anything that either bloodline alone could provide. The plan was elegant in the way that plans built on patience and long perspective are elegant. It required only the right circumstances and the right instrument. Talia's relationship with Bruce Wayne resists the simplified version that reduces her entirely to that instrument, because the simplification is not honest about what existed between them or about the specific quality of the people it reduces. She had encountered him not as an assignment to be executed, but as an extraordinary person whose qualities she recognized with the recognition of someone who had been raised around extraordinary people and therefore possessed reliable instruments for identifying what extraordinary actually was. The League had given her many things, most of them useful and some of them genuinely terrible, but it had also given her a comprehensive education in human capability, and Bruce Wayne was the most capable human being she had ever encountered, who had not been made so by the League's specific methods. She loved him in the specific and complicated way that a person loves someone when that love is genuine and simultaneously embedded in a context that uses it as an instrument, when the feeling is true and the circumstances that produce the opportunity for the feeling are not incidental to its existence, but constitutive of it. The love was not a performance, and it was not simply a strategy, though it served strategic purposes that Ra's al Ghul had anticipated and that Talia was not entirely unaware of. It was real in the way that feelings are real, even when they arrive through circumstances that were deliberately arranged to produce them, in the way that seeds planted in calculated soil still grow into genuine living things whose nature cannot be entirely predicted by the person who planted them. Bruce Wayne loved her in return, also in a complicated way, also with the characteristic reservation that the cave had left as its permanent modification of his capacity for love, protecting something from the feeling even as he experienced it, unable to offer the unguarded completeness that genuine intimacy might otherwise have demanded because the formation of his particular psychology had made unguarded completeness operationally inadvisable in ways he could no longer cleanly distinguish from constitutionally impossible. The wall between what he felt and what he permitted himself to express was not dishonesty, but damage. The specific damage of someone who had decided very early that the world was unsafe and had organized every subsequent year of his life around the management of that decision. His love for Talia was among the most real things about his adult life, which is also to say it was among the most guarded, the most carefully protected against the full implications of its own existence. Between them, something genuine existed, and from that genuine thing, through circumstances whose specific nature the story's different tellings have approached with different degrees of directness and different conclusions about where moral responsibility resided, the question of consent that the canon has returned to and revised across its history in ways that reflect changing understandings of what those circumstances required. Damian Wayne was conceived. Talia's decision to carry the pregnancy and raise the child within the League's structure was not made in defiance of Ra's al Ghul, but in alignment with an agenda. His vision of succession had always contained as a possibility, and in expression of a love for the child that was genuine from the beginning, even when it was also instrumental from the beginning, because Talia was someone capable of holding both of those things simultaneously without resolving the tension between them into something simpler and more comfortable. She would love her son. She would also use her son. These facts coexisted in her, the way that many of her most significant characteristics coexisted, not reconciled, but maintained in parallel, each real, each informing the other, neither cancelling the other out. The League received the child as it received everything as a resource to be developed, a potential to be cultivated, a future capability to be shaped from the earliest possible moment toward the specific qualities and commitments that the mission required. Damian Wayne would be trained as no child outside the League's walls was trained, educated in every discipline that the League's centuries of accumulated knowledge encompassed, shaped by a philosophical framework that understood the world as a hierarchy of capability in which the capable had obligations to the incapable, that looked, from the outside, rather more like authority than stewardship. He would be prepared for the role that his bloodlines had designated for him before he was born. The parallel development of the heretic existed alongside all of this as one of the most disturbing features of the world that had produced him a clone grown from Damian's own DNA, accelerated to adulthood through processes that the League's considerable resources made possible, trained as an instrument of Leviathan's agenda, a copy of himself, given life not from love or from ambition but from contingency, from the institutional acknowledgement that even children made to order could not be entirely relied upon to become what their makers required. The heretic was the plan's insurance policy, its admission that Damian might fail to be what the League needed him to be, and its preparation for that failure expressed in the most literal possible form, a replacement assembled from the same materials, but without the complicating variables of genuine childhood development, genuine relationships, genuine time. The two bloodlines that had combined to produce Damian were not equivalent in their influence on his early formation, because his early formation occurred entirely within one of them. The Wayne heritage existed in him at the level of genetics and of stories, a distant father whose capabilities were acknowledged with the grudging respect that the League extended to anyone sufficiently extraordinary, a man who had repeatedly refused what the League offered and survived the consequences of that refusal, with an consistency that Ra's al Ghul found simultaneously infuriating and confirming of his assessment. Damian knew his father existed. He did not know his father. The Al Ghul formation was everything immediate and everything constant, the language he spoke, the way he moved, the philosophical framework through which he understood the world and his place within it, the specific expectations of the people around him that constituted the entire social reality of his daily existence. The League had not simply trained him, it had made him, in the sense that the most formative institutions always make the people who inhabit them from the beginning, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated daily pressure of an environment designed to produce specific qualities and eliminate others, applied across every waking hour of a childhood that had never been permitted to be simply a childhood. He was born into a story that had been in progress for a very long time, written by people whose ambitions and whose love and whose failures and whose extraordinary capabilities had combined to produce in him a question that none of them had quite anticipated. What would a child made from all of this choose to become, when the choosing eventually became available to him? The answer would take years to arrive. It would arrive at enormous cost, through losses that would reshape everyone who witnessed them. And it would not be the answer that anyone who had planned his existence had planned for, because the one variable that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of experience had not fully accounted for, the variable that Talia's complicated love had introduced into an otherwise calculated equation, was the possibility that the child would turn out to be a person rather than a product. And persons, given sufficient time and sufficient exposure to the right influences, sustained across enough years by someone patient enough and warm enough to offer them, without condition, had a habit of becoming something other than what they were designed to become. The League of Assassins was not, despite its name, primarily an organization of killers. This is a distinction that the name makes easy to miss, and that the organization's actual nature made essential to understand, because reducing it to its most dramatic function was precisely the misunderstanding that made it most dangerous to those who encountered it without preparation. Killing was a capability the League maintained and deployed with the efficiency that it brought to every capability it maintained and deployed. But the League's actual project was something larger and more systematic than killing, something that required killing. The way that any comprehensive project requires the tools specific to its requirements, not as the point, but as one instrument among many, in service of a vision that transcended any individual application of any individual instrument. The League was an institution of formation. It took people, young people, primarily, people whose developmental material was still available for shaping, and it made them into specific things the League required for its mission and could not obtain from the world outside its walls in the form and quality it demanded. It had been doing this for centuries, refining its methods through the accumulated experience of every generation it had produced, incorporating the lessons of every success and every failure into a developmental philosophy that was, by the time Damian Wayne entered the world, among the most sophisticated and most thoroughly tested approaches to the deliberate production of a specific kind of human being that had ever been devised. Damian entered this institution at the beginning of everything. He did not arrive at the League as an outside recruit, someone who had developed elsewhere and been identified and recruited through the channels by which the League occasionally supplemented its internally produced membership. He was formed within it from birth, which meant that the League's methods did not need to work against any prior formation, did not need to undo habits of thought and feeling produced by other influences before installing its own. The canvas was blank, or as close to blank as a child carrying two extraordinary genetic inheritances could ever be, and the League understood how to use blank canvases with a thoroughness that the word training did not quite capture. The martial education began before Damian could fully understand what he was being trained for, which was not incidental to the training's design, but essential to it. The League had long understood something that conventional education consistently failed to grasp, that the body learns differently than the mind. That physical capability absorbed before the conscious mind is fully developed becomes something closer to instinct than to skill. That a fighter who has been moving in specific ways since before memory has a relationship with those movements, that a fighter who learned them as an adult can never replicate, regardless of dedication or intelligence. Damian's body was being shaped before his understanding was in a position to consent to or resist the shaping, which was precisely when the shaping was most effective. By the time he was old enough to be fully conscious of his training and its purposes, the training had already produced things in him that consciousness could not reverse: reflexes, movement patterns, a specific relationship with his own physical capability that expressed itself as a kind of settled certainty about what his body could do and what it was for. He was extraordinary in the way that the League's finest were always extraordinary, which is to say, he was extraordinary in ways that had required the systematic elimination of the ordinary human hesitations and vulnerabilities that made most people merely human rather than something the League found more useful. The philosophical education was parallel to the physical one, and in many ways more consequential for who Damian became and what he believed about the world he was eventually sent into. The League did not simply train bodies. It trained minds, which in practice meant it trained the frameworks through which minds understood everything they encountered, the assumptions about human nature, about justice, about the relationship between capability and authority, about what the world owed to whom and on what basis. That constituted the invisible architecture within which all conscious thought occurred. These frameworks were installed not through explicit instruction alone, but through the accumulated experience of living within an institution that expressed them in every aspect of its daily operation, so that the child absorbed them the way children absorb language, through immersion, through use, through the gradual discovery that the world made sense through these frameworks in ways that it would not make sense through alternatives. The League's world was a world organized by capability. Those who were capable owed nothing to those who were not, except in the specific cases where the capable chose to extend protection or instruction as expressions of their own purposes, rather than obligations owed. Justice was not the equal treatment of unequal people, but the appropriate response to demonstrated quality. Those who were strong deserved what strength could obtain. Those who were weak deserved what weakness could protect. And the distance between these outcomes was not tragedy but logic. Compassion was a luxury that the capable could afford occasionally, and the incapable could not survive depending on. The world did not owe kindness. The world owed only what could be taken from it by those sufficiently capable of taking. Damian absorbed all of this with the thoroughness of a child who has no alternative frameworks to compare it against, no outside experience that might introduce doubt about whether this particular account of reality was the only available account. He believed. Because believing had never been offered as optional, the League did not present its philosophical framework as one perspective among several competing ones, but as the simple description of how things actually were, and children raised within a single account of reality tend to mistake that account for reality itself, until something external introduces sufficient friction to make the distinction legible. The specific cruelties that the League's training required were not random or sadistic, which in some ways made them more difficult to process than cruelty motivated by individual pathology would have been. Individual cruelty has a source that can be identified and, at least theoretically, addressed a particular person with a particular damage, expressing that damage in a particular direction. Institutional cruelty has no such source and admits no such address. It is cruelty that has been justified, organized, and systematized. Cruelty that exists because the institution has determined that it produces necessary results. Cruelty that arrives not as someone's failure, but as the correct operation of a system functioning exactly as designed. The League required its trainees to kill, and Damian killed. And the first killing was different from the killings that followed in ways that he carried with him, even after the subsequent killings had accumulated into something that no longer required processing in the same deliberate, effortful way. The League did not regard this first killing as a trauma to be addressed, but as a threshold to be crossed, a developmental milestone as significant and as unremarkable as any other milestone, evidence that the training had successfully produced in this particular student the capacity that the training was designed to produce. The fact that the crossing of this threshold might produce something in the student that would need to be managed, that the production of a capacity for killing also produced, in some students, a relationship with that capacity that was complicated in ways the League preferred to resolve through suppression rather than integration, was not ignored, but was treated as a technical problem rather than a moral one. Talia's motherhood was the most genuinely complicated aspect of the environment that produced Damian, and it deserves examination with the same care that she deserves, which is to say, with neither the simplification that reduces her to a villain instrumentalizing her child, nor the simplification that reduces her to a victim of her own upbringing incapable of genuine agency. She loved Damian. The love was real, present in the specific ways that genuine maternal love is present in the protection she extended to him against the League's most extreme tendencies, in the moments when her own ambitions for him were suspended in favor of simple presence, in the quality of attention she gave him that was different in kind from the attention the League gave him, because hers was personal, in ways that institutional attention never quite managed to be. She also used him, not in the cold, calculated way that the simplest version of her story suggests, but in the way that people who love someone and simultaneously have a plan for them always use them by shaping the love into the plan, by allowing her genuine affection to serve her genuine agenda, by making the distinction between what was for him and what was for her purposes increasingly difficult to draw clearly enough to be useful. She prepared him for the role that had been designed for him, and she did so with care and thoroughness. And the care and thoroughness were real, even when the role they were serving was one he had never consented to fill. What Damian knew about himself by the time he departed for Gotham was this: he was the finest product the League had ever produced. He was the heir to two of the most significant bloodlines that the post-war world of extraordinary individuals contained. He was destined for a role that would shape the future of human civilization in ways that the ordinary people he would encounter could not comprehend. He was superior in ways that were not merely his opinion but the confirmed assessment of every authority his formation had taught him to trust. And he was going to meet the father who was one half of the reason for his existence, the man from whom half his capabilities derived, the detective who had refused every invitation to join the League, and whose son was now being delivered to him as the League's final word on the subject of Bruce Wayne's legacy. He had been given, in 17 years of the most intensive formation the League could provide, everything the League considered necessary. What he had not been given was the thing that the League did not know how to give, and had not thought to miss the experience of being loved without an agenda attached to the love, the specific developmental nutrient of being regarded as someone whose value was not contingent on what they would eventually become, but simply present in what they already were. This absence would manifest, when he arrived in Gotham, as a kind of contempt for everything that was not strength, a brittleness beneath the extraordinary competence, and a hunger for something that he could not have named because he had never experienced it, and therefore had no language for it. He carried his bloodline forward into a city that had no adequate preparation for him, toward a father who had no adequate preparation for him, into a life that would eventually offer him what the League never had the possibility of being, something other than what he had been made to be. That possibility would not arrive easily or quickly or without cost. The formation the League had achieved was thorough and real, and would not be revised simply because he had left the institution that had produced it. But it could be contested. That was the thing the League had failed to anticipate, and the thing that would eventually matter most, not that formation was impossible to achieve, but that it was possible to contest, given the right sustained influences and enough time. He arrived in Gotham carrying 10 years of the most sophisticated institutional formation that a child had ever received, and he arrived also carrying within himself, beneath everything the League had installed, the irreducible fact of being his father's son, possessing qualities that the League had not put there and could not have, qualities that would eventually begin to make themselves known in the specific friction between what he had been made into and what he was finding himself to be. Damian Wayne did not arrive in Gotham the way that most arrivals happen. Gradually, with preparation on both sides, with the kind of contextual scaffolding that allows people to receive a new presence in their lives without being entirely restructured by the receiving, he arrived the way that significant things arrive in Bruce Wayne's life, which is to say suddenly and without adequate warning, and with the immediate quality of something that could not be unhappened, regardless of how anyone involved might feel about it. Talia delivered him. This is the precise word for what occurred, not introduced, not brought, but delivered, with the specific implication of something transmitted from one party to another, as the completion of an arrangement whose terms had been established long before the delivery itself. She brought him to his father with the confidence of someone fulfilling a plan that had always included this moment. And she departed with the equally confident assurance that the boy she was leaving behind would proceed from this point according to the trajectory that his formation had established for him. She had done her part. The League had done its part. What happened next was, in her calculation, largely a matter of the qualities she had ensured he possessed, expressing themselves in the environment she had placed him in. Bruce Wayne received his son with the specific difficulty of someone encountering a situation for which even his extraordinary preparation had provided no adequate framework. He had encountered nearly everything that Gotham and the world beyond it could produce: criminals of exceptional capability, adversaries of exceptional intelligence, threats that required responses beyond anything conventional resources could provide. He had not encountered this. A 10-year-old child with his own face and Talia's eyes, carrying himself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been given serious reason to doubt his own assessment of his own superiority, arriving in the cave with the manner of someone taking possession of an inheritance rather than meeting a parent for the first time. The first confrontation with Tim Drake was not incidental, but symptomatic, a collision between two entirely incompatible understandings of what the situation meant and what it entitled each of its participants to claim. Tim Drake had earned his place in the cave through the same combination of intelligence and dedication and demonstrated commitment that had earned every previous Robin their place, through the specific process by which Bruce Wayne extended trust, which was slowly and with the constant implicit requirement of continued demonstration. He was Robin because he had proved himself Robin, because his claim to the role was a claim constructed from accumulated evidence rather than from birthright. Damian's understanding of the situation was precisely inverse. He was Robin because he was Robin, because the bloodlines that had produced him made the role his by a logic that preceded any question of earned entitlement, because his capabilities exceeded Tim's in ways that were simply factual rather than matters requiring proof, because the son of the Batman and the grandson of Ra's al Ghul was not a person who demonstrated his fitness for roles he was born into, but a person who occupied those roles and allowed others to adjust to that occupancy. The contempt he expressed toward Tim was not performed or tactical, but genuine, the authentic response of someone who had been raised to understand the world as organized by hierarchy and who assessed the hierarchy with the clarity that his formation had equipped him to assess it. The violence of his early days in Gotham was not, in Damian's understanding, violence at all. It was the application of capability to problems in the most efficient manner available, and efficiency was a value the League had installed in him so deeply that the question of whether efficiency was the only relevant consideration had never been raised, and had therefore never been answered in any way that might complicate the calculation. He fought with a thoroughness that exceeded what the situations he encountered required, because the League had trained him to eliminate threats completely rather than to calibrate his response to the minimum necessary. And the distinction between these approaches was one that his formation had not established as significant. The killing of the villain Spook presented itself to Damian as a simple problem with a simple solution, and to the cave as something considerably more complex. The person Damian had killed was, by any assessment that the cave's values could generate, not a person deserving of protection, someone whose crimes were extensive and whose continued existence posed ongoing dangers. The objection was not to the target but to the act, to the specific decision to end a life when ending it had not been necessary, when alternatives existed that would have served every legitimate purpose that the engagement required. This distinction between what was permissible in extremis and what was permissible when alternatives were available was a distinction that the League had not taught because the League had not considered it relevant, and its absence in Damian's moral architecture was visible in the simplicity with which he described what he had done and the genuine confusion he experienced when its reception was not the reception he had anticipated. Bruce Wayne's response to the arrival of a son he had not known existed was not a single response, but a sustained process of adjustment that contained within it several responses simultaneously, not all of them fully compatible with each other. The protective instinct that had organized his entire adult life was immediately and intensely present. This child was his, whatever the circumstances of that connection, and the cave's resources and Bruce Wayne's capabilities would be deployed in service of his well-being with the completeness that the cave deployed everything. This instinct coexisted with the recognition that the child requiring protection was not a child who could simply receive protection in the way that the instinct understood protection, as operating not a young person who needed to be shielded from harm, but a young person who was himself, at present, a source of harm, whose capabilities and formation made him genuinely dangerous in ways that the protective instinct had to somehow accommodate, without either abandoning the protection or ignoring the danger. There was also the guilt, the specific guilt of someone who understood that this child's formation was, in some meaningful sense, a consequence of his own choices, that the world that had made Damian what he was would not have had the opportunity to make him what he was if Bruce Wayne had made different decisions about his relationship with Talia, had been more present, had been more aware, had managed to be anything other than what the cave had made him at the cost of the capacities that might have prevented this specific outcome. Whether this guilt was entirely warranted, whether the chain of causation was really as direct as it felt in the immediate processing of the situation, was a question that the cave was not a good environment for examining with the equanimity it would have required. The guilt arrived and was processed in the way that the cave processed most things that were not operational problems, by being filed somewhere and not returned to unless something forced its retrieval. Alfred Pennyworth's response was, as it almost always was, the most precise available measure of the situation's actual difficulty. Alfred had maintained his equilibrium through everything the cave had produced, across decades of operation, through injuries and crises, and the various iterations of chaos that Batman's existence reliably generated at the final intersection of extraordinary enemies and the particular psychology of the man who had built the cave. That he found Damian's arrival genuinely difficult was therefore itself a significant piece of information. He managed it with the thoroughness he brought to everything, extending toward Damian the same patient domestic care he extended toward everyone who inhabited the manor. But the quality of patience he brought to the extension was different from its usual quality, more deliberate, more consciously maintained, more clearly a choice rather than a natural expression of his fundamental orientation toward the people in his care. The household dynamic that developed around Damian's presence was unstable in ways that resisted the routine. Stabilization that Alfred's management usually achieved. The cave had hosted tension before, had managed the psychological complexities of multiple people, occupying a space defined by an extraordinary mission and extraordinary methods, had found equilibria that allowed the work to continue even when the people doing the work were in various forms of conflict with each other or with themselves. What it had not previously hosted was a child whose formation was so thoroughly incompatible with the cave's values that his simple daily presence in the space created a persistent, low-level friction that ordinary management could mitigate but could not resolve. Damian wanted to be Robin in the same way that he wanted everything the League had told him was his completely and immediately, and with conviction that the wanting itself was justification for the having. He wanted Tim Drake's position not because he had assessed Tim and found him wanting in specific ways that mattered, but because Tim's occupancy of the position was an affront to a hierarchy that Damian understood as simply descriptive of how things were. The Robin suit belonged to the son of Batman. Tim Drake was not the son of Batman. The logic from Damian's formation was complete. That this logic was not the logic the cave operated by, that the cave's logic was different in ways that Damian did not yet have the framework to fully comprehend, organized around demonstrated merit and chosen relationship rather than bloodline and birthright, was information that his early weeks in Gotham were engaged in delivering in ways he found both confusing and unacceptable. He had been prepared for a world organized in one way. He had arrived in a world organized in another. The friction between these two organizational systems expressed itself, in the immediate term, as the specific quality of contemptuous impatience that everyone around him found so consistently exhausting. But there were also, visible through the contempt if anyone looked for them with sufficient patience, the first signs of something that the contempt was partially covering. Moments when the absolute certainty faltered slightly, when the hierarchy that was supposed to explain everything left something unexplained, when Bruce Wayne did something or said something or simply was something that Damian's formation had not anticipated, and that created, briefly, a quality of attention in him that was different from the calculating attention his training had made automatic. His father was not what the League had described. The League had described capabilities and had described a refusal to use those capabilities in ways the League found correct, and had described, implicitly, someone whose values were a form of limitation. What Damian was encountering was something that the description had not captured: someone whose values were a form of architecture, as comprehensive and as structural as anything the League had built in him, but organized toward different ends and expressing itself in ways that the League's framework gave him no tools to assess. He would not acknowledge this for a long time. The formation that had produced him had also produced the defenses that protected the formation, and those defenses were as thoroughly installed as everything else. But something had begun in the first days in Gotham that the League had not anticipated, and that Damian himself could not yet name: the first very faint contact between the person he had been made into and the world that would eventually offer him the possibility of becoming something else. The cave had received him. The cave would not release him unchanged, but what the change would require and what it would cost was still entirely ahead of them both. The period of Bruce Wayne's absence from Gotham, his displacement through time following the events that removed him from the present, the gap between his departure and his eventual return, is a period that the legend of Batman tends to treat as an interruption, a pause between the real chapters of the story that is best understood as the space between something ending and its resumption. This treatment is understandable and almost entirely wrong, because what occurred during Bruce Wayne's absence was not a pause, but a continuation. And in certain specific and important respects, it was a continuation that produced results the original would not have produced and could not have produced, because it was conducted by someone who was not the original and who was not attempting to be. Dick Grayson became Batman during this period and has already been examined at length in the stories that belong to him. What has not been examined with sufficient attention is what Dick Grayson's Batman meant specifically for Damian Wayne, what the specific qualities that Dick brought to the identity, the specific ways his Batman differed from Bruce's, produced in a child whose formation had prepared him for one kind of mentor, and who encountered instead something that his formation had not anticipated and could not have prepared him for. Dick had not wanted the role. This fact is important for understanding the specific quality of what he brought to it, because the reluctance was not the reluctance of someone uncertain about their capability, but the reluctance of someone who understood precisely what accepting the role would mean and had worked hard and at genuine personal cost to build an identity that was not organized around it. He had been Robin. He had grown beyond Robin into Nightwing, and the growth had required, among other things, the development of an explicit understanding of how his psychology differed from Bruce's and why those differences mattered, why the cave's methods produced results but also produced damage, why the specific formation Bruce Wayne had received and then transmitted had costs that Dick was not willing to continue paying without acknowledging them as costs. He accepted the cowl because the alternative was worse in the specific and immediate sense that if he did not become Batman, someone else would. And the field of candidates was not reassuring. He accepted it as a protective choice, which was itself a characteristically Dick Grayson form of reason, not the absolute commitment that had driven Bruce Wayne, not the mission as organizing principle of existence, but the particular kind of responsibility that comes from being the person capable of doing something that needs to be done and choosing to do it because the need is real and the capability is present and declining on the basis of personal preference seems, under those circumstances, like an insufficient justification. The choice to make Damian Robin was the most consequential decision Dick made during his tenure, and it was not a decision that the Batman family around him greeted with uniform enthusiasm. The reasonable objections were numerous and specific. A 10-year-old assassin who had already demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to kill, whose formation had been conducted by an organization explicitly hostile to everything Batman represented, whose contempt for everyone around him was not diplomatic exaggeration but genuine assessment, was not an obvious candidate for the role of Batman's partner in protecting Gotham's citizens. The risks were operational and moral simultaneously, and the people who raised them were not wrong to raise them. Dick made the choice anyway, and he made it on the basis of an assessment that went deeper than the operational calculation, on the basis of what he observed when he looked at Damian Wayne, not as a threat profile to be managed, but as a child to be understood. What he saw, beneath the contempt and the capability and the absolute certainty, was someone who needed something that the League's formation had been unable to provide, and that Bruce Wayne's formation had left Bruce unable to offer. Someone who needed to be regarded as a person rather than an amount asset, who needed the experience of sustained positive attention from someone who was not calculating what he would eventually become, but was simply present with who he currently was. Dick Grayson had been that child once, in the specific sense that mattered, not an assassin's child, not someone raised within an institution that treated human beings as instruments of its purposes, but a child whose parents had died in front of him and who had been taken in by a man whose love for him was genuine and whose ability to express that love was compromised by damage the man had never adequately addressed. He had survived Bruce Wayne's care and had eventually built something healthy from the complicated inheritance of it, and he understood from the inside what the difference was between being given training and being given genuine regard, between being developed as a capable person and being developed as a capable asset. He intended to offer Damian the version he had not received, but had eventually learned to give himself. The dynamic that developed between Dick's Batman and Damian's Robin in the early weeks of their partnership was the first dynamic of two people occupying an enormous psychological distance from each other and attempting to conduct a functional professional relationship across that distance without any shared framework adequate to bridge it. Damian's contempt was consistent and specific, and sometimes quite impressive in its precision. He had the assessor's eye that the League had trained him to develop, and he applied it to Dick's performance as Batman with the thoroughness of someone conducting a formal evaluation, noting every departure from what he considered optimal methodology, every decision that reflected sentiment rather than efficiency, every moment when Dick's warmth toward the people they were protecting produced behavior that Damian's training categorized as operationally suboptimal. Dick received this evaluation with something that was not quite patience and not quite amusement, but occupied the space between them, the response of someone who had been here before in the specific sense of having once been the person doing the evaluation, who remembered what it was to be a young person with extraordinary capability and a comprehensive framework that explained everything, and a deep need to demonstrate that the framework was working as intended. He did not argue. He did not withdraw. He continued to do what he was doing in the way he was doing it, and he continued to regard Damian as someone worth doing it alongside. And he did both of these things with the consistency that was the specific form his care took when it was most genuinely operative. The cases they worked together in those early months accumulated into a record that revealed, over time, something that neither of them would have initially predicted: that they worked together effectively, and that the effectiveness was not despite their differences, but partly because of them. Damian's capabilities were exactly what they appeared to be, which was extraordinary, and Dick had the tactical intelligence to deploy them in ways that maximized their value, while the specific quality of his leadership minimized the risk that those capabilities would be applied in directions that required subsequent management. He did not treat Damian as a weapon to be aimed, but as a partner whose judgment he was actively engaged in helping to develop. And the distinction between these approaches was not lost on Damian, even when he would not acknowledge it. There were moments. The legend of this period tends to remember the dramatic moments, the confrontations, the times when Damian's formation collided most visibly with the cave's values and required intervention. But the moments that actually mattered most were smaller and less dramatic, and would have been invisible to anyone not paying the specific quality of attention that Dick was paying. A moment when Damian chose a non-lethal resolution to a situation where a lethal one was available and would have been simpler. A moment when he offered something that was almost, not quite, but almost a form of apology to someone he had treated with the particular dismissiveness of someone who had not yet learned that people's feelings were relevant considerations rather than operational variables. A moment when he asked Dick a question about something that was not tactical or strategic, a question about the kind that revealed an interior life that was developing in directions his formation had not entirely determined. Dick noticed all of them. He did not make a production of noticing, did not offer praise in ways that would have triggered Damian's defenses, or manufactured occasions for the kind of emotional processing that Damian was not yet capable of conducting without significant resistance. He simply continued to be present, continued to offer the consistent regard that he had committed to offering, continued to treat every small movement in Damian towards something that the League had not installed as worth sustaining through the specific form of attention that made things worth sustaining, acknowledgement that did not demand more than was given, recognition that did not convert the small thing into an obligation to produce larger things on an accelerated schedule. The children that Dick and Damian protected together during this period received, from Damian's hands, a quality of protection that would have surprised anyone who had observed only his early weeks in Gotham. He was still not gentle. The League had produced efficiency rather than gentleness, and efficiency was what they received. But he was present with them in a way that he had not been present with anyone in his early days, in a way that suggested something operating beneath the efficiency that was doing its own quiet work. He noticed when a child was frightened in ways that went beyond the immediate situation, in ways that suggested something larger and more persistent. He noticed, and he did not notice, which was the specific form that his development took in this period, not yet capable of the full response, but no longer capable of the complete absence of response either. His relationship with Alfred Pennyworth developed during this period in the particular way that relationships with Alfred always developed, through the accumulated small occasions of domestic life that Alfred managed with his characteristic thoroughness, and that provided, for anyone willing to inhabit them properly, the specific kind of non-pressured proximity that allowed trust to develop in people who found direct trust too vulnerable to offer directly. Alfred fed Damian. He maintained the spaces Damian occupied. He noticed when Damian was unwell in ways that Damian had been trained to conceal, and he addressed those occasions with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything, without making them into more than they needed to be, and without ignoring them either. He was, perhaps, the first person in Damian's life who cared for him with the specific quality of care that had no agenda attached, not building toward anything, not developing him toward any purpose, simply maintaining his well-being, because his well-being was worth maintaining for its own sake. The specific things Damian was becoming under Dick's influence were visible to anyone who had known him at the beginning, in the accumulation of small contrasts between the child who had arrived and the child who was present now. The contempt was less total. It remained. The League had installed it too deeply for it to disappear quickly or easily, but it had developed exceptions. specific people toward whom it did not operate, or operated with less completeness than it had initially. The exceptions were telling. They were the people who had offered him consistent, genuine regard without conditions attached, and their exemption from his default assessment was his unconscious acknowledgement that the regard they offered was something real and something he valued in ways that his framework had not provided for valuing. He was not yet healed. That word is almost comically inadequate to describe the distance between where he was and where the word implies. He was a child whose formation had been conducted by one of the most sophisticated institutions of deliberate human shaping that the post-war world contained. And that formation did not dissolve in months because a warm and patient person was offering him consistent positive regard. What it did was begin to develop fissures, not cracks, not even fractures, but the first very fine lines along which something might eventually move if sufficient pressure was applied in the right direction over sufficient time. Bruce Wayne's return from his displacement interrupted this process at a moment that made the interruption particularly significant, not at a beginning, when Damian would have had no loss to absorb, and not at a completion, when the development might have been secure enough to survive the disruption, but somewhere in the delicate middle where the work had progressed enough to be real and not far enough to be stable. What Dick had built was genuine. What Bruce's return required of it was complicated. The transition from Dick's Batman to Bruce's reclaimed the cowl in ways that were ultimately appropriate and yet still constituted, for Damian, a particular kind of loss, the loss of the specific relationship that the specific person had offered, the one relationship in his life so far that had operated according to the logic of genuine care rather than the logic of development toward a predetermined end. He did not name this loss because he did not yet have the language for what he had received, or the understanding that its withdrawal constituted something that could legitimately be called loss. But it registered in the specific, quiet way that significant things register in people who do not yet have the tools to process them directly, as a shift in the quality of daily life, as an absence that organized itself around the shape of what had been present, as the first intimation that things which mattered could be taken away, not through violence or failure, but simply through the ordinary processes of change that a life in motion always produced. Dick Grayson had given Damian Wayne something the League had never given him, and Bruce Wayne had not yet figured out how to give the experience of being genuinely seen and genuinely valued in the present tense, without the conditions of future capability attached. It was a gift that would continue operating in him long after its immediate source had been removed. The League had made him extraordinary. Dick Grayson had begun, quietly and patiently and without announcement, the longer project of making him human. Bruce Wayne came back from the dead, as Bruce Wayne tended to do, and the return was complicated in the specific ways that Bruce Wayne's returns from impossible situations were always complicated, not simply because the situation that had produced the absence was itself extraordinary, but because the world had continued in his absence in ways that his return did not automatically reverse, and the relationships that had reorganized themselves around that absence could not simply reorganize themselves again without cost to everyone involved in the reorganization. He came back to a Gotham that had continued without him, to a cave that had been maintained and operated by someone who had done so with genuine capability and genuine care, to a son he had left at the beginning of something and was returning to find partway through it. The partway through was important. Damian was not the child who had arrived in the cave during Bruce's last days of presence, was not precisely that child, had moved in directions that the child who arrived had not yet begun to move, had accumulated weeks of the specific developmental experience that Dick Grayson's particular qualities had made possible. Returning to this child and taking up the relationship that his absence had meant he had never fully established required starting from where Damian currently was, rather than from where Bruce had last seen him. And where Damian currently was included a relationship with Dick that had produced things Bruce would need to understand before he could build anything that would last. Bruce Wayne's approach to fatherhood was the approach of someone who had built everything he was around a particular kind of absolute commitment, and who applied that same orientation to every significant undertaking, complete, methodical, organized toward outcomes rather than processes, attentive to capability development in ways that sometimes lost sight of the distinction between developing a person's capabilities and developing a person. He was not indifferent to Damian. The intensity of his investment in Damian's well-being was evident in every decision he made about Damian's training, Damian's safety, Damian's exposure to the specific categories of threat that Bruce had assessed as most dangerous given Damian's history and formation. The investment was real. The question was whether the form it took was the form Damian most needed it to take. And the answer to that question was complicated by the specific nature of what Bruce Wayne's formation had left him able to offer. The cave had made Bruce Wayne extraordinary at protecting people. It had made him somewhat less extraordinary at being present with them in the way that being present genuinely, without the management overlay that his operational instincts applied to every interaction that mattered to him required. This was not a character failure in any simple sense, but the specific cost of the specific formation that had produced him, the damage that the vow in the study had set in motion, and decades of operating from that damage had compounded. He knew this about himself, or knew it in the limited way that people know things about themselves when those things are sufficiently central to how they function, that acknowledging them fully would require restructuring everything built on their foundation. He compensated for it through the intensity of the protective investment, through ensuring that the forms of care he was capable of providing were provided with absolute thoroughness, through the hope that thoroughness might substitute for the kinds of presence that thoroughness alone could not provide. Damian received all of this, the protection, the training, the methodical attention to his development as a capable person, and registered also its limits, in the specific way that children register the limits of the care available to them, which is not always as disappointment but sometimes as the simple adjustment of expectations to match the available reality. He knew, because the League had given him the assessor's eye that evaluated everything and everyone with equal thoroughness, what Bruce Wayne was and what Bruce Wayne was not. He knew his father was extraordinary. He knew his father was also, in the specific register that the months with Dick Grayson had opened him to, somewhat less available in the ways that had mattered during that period than Dick had been. He did not resent this, or did not resent it in the straightforward way. What he felt was more complex and less nameable, a kind of permanent adjustment, the internal renegotiation of what he was reaching for when he reached toward Bruce, an understanding that the relationship would express itself through different channels than the one that Dick had occupied. He accepted the training, he accepted the missions, he accepted the specific form of regard that Bruce Wayne was capable of extending, which was fierce and protective and thoroughly organized toward his survival and development, and not always warm in the register that warmth required. He accepted all of this because the alternative was not a more available version of Bruce Wayne, but simply the absence of Bruce Wayne. And absence was something he understood from the inside, in ways that made its presence preferable to even a complicated form of its opposite. The Robin role under Bruce's Batman operated with a different quality than it had under Dick's. Dick had treated Robin as a partnership in the genuine sense of the word, two people bringing different capabilities to a shared project, each meaningfully contributing to the direction and execution of that project. The more experienced partner guiding rather than directing, the less experienced partner developing through genuine participation rather than through controlled deployment. Bruce's Batman treated Robin as something between a partnership and an apprenticeship, with the balance tipping toward apprenticeship in ways that reflected both the legitimate assessment that Damian still had significant development ahead of him, and the less easily acknowledged difficulty that genuine partnership required, a quality of mutual exposure that Bruce's formation made difficult to sustain. Damian adapted to this, as he adapted to most things, through the combination of genuine capability and thorough external compliance that concealed whatever internal response the adaptation required. He was good at compliance, that was not fully compliance at producing the behavioral surface of acceptance, while maintaining a genuine interior in which his own assessments continued to operate and his own development continued to proceed according to its own logic, rather than exclusively according to the logic provided from outside. The League had trained this capacity in him as a survival skill, the ability to present a face to institutional authority that satisfied that authority's requirements, while preserving beneath it the genuine self that the institution was always attempting to subsume. He used it now not defensively but adaptively, not to protect himself from Bruce, but to maintain the continuity of his own development within a relationship that offered some of what he needed and not all of it. Talia's continued presence in Damian's life was the thread of complication that neither the cave nor its occupants could fully manage, because Talia's relationship with her son was not something that could be addressed through the cave's methods or resolved through the cave's values. She was his mother. The love she bore him was real, operating in its complicated way alongside her agenda for him, and Damian's love for her was equally real, equally complicated by the specific quality of a relationship with someone who had given him everything and simultaneously shaped him toward purposes that he was beginning, incrementally and without full consciousness of the process, to find inadequate to the person he was becoming. She visited his development with the attention of someone monitoring an investment, which it was, and with the attention of someone watching their child grow, which it also was. And the combination of these two forms of attention produced in her responses to his development a quality of complexity that Damian navigated with the skill the League had trained him for navigating complex situations, but that sometimes produced in him a tiredness that the League had not prepared him to manage. Her expectations were comprehensive. They encompassed the full scope of the role he had been produced to fill, the heir to the Al Ghul legacy, the eventual instrument of the League's succession, the continuation of a purpose that predated his birth and would outlast any individual life, including his own. She wanted this for him with the genuine conviction of someone who believed that this purpose was the greatest purpose available in the world as it actually existed. She also, genuinely, wanted him to be well, in the limited way that the League's framework allowed well-being to be understood, which was as the condition of someone whose capabilities were fully developed and fully deployed in service of appropriate purposes. This was not a false form of care, but a constrained one. Care that had been defined by a vision of what flourishing was, that Damian was beginning to find insufficient without yet being able to articulate why the insufficiency registered as insufficiency. The months with Dick had given him a reference point, an experience of well-being understood differently, understood as something that included, but was not limited to capability and purpose, that had a texture the League's version of well-being had not contained. The comparison operated in him below the level of explicit thought, producing a persistent low-level dissonance between what Talia offered and what he had learned to understand as available. Bruce Wayne's attempts to be a father were genuine, imperfect, and improving with the kind of incremental improvement that only becomes visible over time and in retrospect. He was not a man who processed his failures quickly or who arrived easily at the acknowledgement that the approaches he had developed through decades of operating from his particular kind of damage were approaches that produced specific costs when applied to relationships that required something different from what they were equipped to provide. He was, however, a man who could learn, in the specific way that people of exceptional intelligence and genuine moral commitment learn when they are confronted with evidence that their current methods are not achieving their intended results slowly, against resistance, with the occasional emergence of something that, in a less defended person, might be called vulnerability, but in Bruce Wayne was more accurately described as the brief suspension of the management that ordinarily kept the genuine interior from too much contact with the world outside it. These moments were infrequent, and they were not dramatic, and they were precisely the moments that mattered most to Damian. because they were the moments when the enormous competence that his father inhabited relaxed slightly, and something human became briefly visible within it, something that recognized him not as an extraordinary child to be developed, but as a person to be known. The moments did not last. They retreated behind the management overlay, with the efficiency of someone who had been practicing that retreat for decades. But they left traces, and the traces accumulated into something that functioned across the weeks and months of their life in the cave together, as the foundation of a relationship that was not what either of them would have designed if designing had been available to them, but that was real in its own specific and imperfect way. He was his father's son. This was becoming apparent to both of them through the experience of operating together, through the specific quality of Damian's intelligence and moral seriousness that was not the League's product, but something that predated the League's formation of him, something that had been there before the League got to it, that the League had worked with and around, rather than producing from nothing. Bruce Wayne recognized it with the specific recognition of encountering something familiar in an unexpected context. The quality of meeting in someone else, a characteristic you have so thoroughly internalized that you no longer perceive it as a characteristic, but simply as the way things are. His son thought about justice the way he thought about justice, with a completeness that refused to accept easy resolutions, with a moral seriousness that extended to every situation the same quality of attention that most people reserved for the situations they had already decided were important. The formation had worked against this, had attempted to shape this essential quality toward the League's ends, rather than allowing it its own direction. The formation had not succeeded completely. Something in the inheritance, in the specific combination of Bruce Wayne's particular orientation, and whatever Talia had genuinely passed to her son beyond the League's curriculum, had maintained a core of the essential characteristic in a form that the League had been unable to fully redirect. It was there, operating beneath the contempt and the efficiency and the comprehensive assessment of every hierarchy Damian encountered. It was the thing that, given time and the right sustained conditions, would eventually express itself as heroism rather than as capability in service of an institution's purposes. The father and son were, across the months of their complicated shared life in the cave, building something. It was not the relationship either of them had the formation to simply inhabit naturally, but it was a relationship constructed imperfectly from available materials by two people who were each, in their different ways, genuinely trying. That the trying was genuine mattered enormously, even when the results of the trying were limited by the limitations of what the trying had available to work with. They were learning each other, slowly, and with the resistance that both of their formations inserted into the process of learning people. And the learning was real, even when it was slow, and even when it produced as much confusion as clarity. Damian Wayne was his father's son in the cave, learning what that meant from the inside of a relationship that had no instruction manual and no precedent adequate to its specific combination of extraordinary circumstances. The learning was, like everything else in his life so far, going to cost something. The question was what it would eventually produce. The transformation that occurred in Damian Wayne across the years of his Robin tenure was not the transformation of someone who had been wrong becoming right, or of someone who had been bad becoming good, because those framings were insufficient to the actual complexity of what happened and dishonest about the nature of what he had been. He had not been wrong in the way that suggests a simple correction available through the application of better information. He had been formed thoroughly, systematically, with the accumulated expertise of an institution that had been producing a specific kind of person for centuries. And what occurred across those years was not the replacement of that formation, but its contestation. The gradual and costly and genuinely remarkable process by which the person beneath the formation began to make itself known through the formation, rather than simply behind it. The animal companions were among the first and most visible expressions of this process, and their significance in the record of Damian's development is not incidental. Titus arrived as a dog, which is to say as a creature whose relationship to human beings is organized entirely around attachment rather than utility, whose presence in any life constitutes an implicit argument for a form of connection that does not require justification through function or capability or the demonstration of worth. The League had not given Damian animals. The League had given him opponents, training partners, assessment criteria, hierarchies, purposes. It had not given him anything whose only claim on his attention was that it was alive and present and needed care. He gave the dog the care with the specific quality of someone discovering that they were capable of something they had not known they were capable of, not with the ease of someone doing something natural, but with the slight excess of attention that accompanies the encounter with an unexpected capacity, the extra presence that arrives when something turns out to matter in a way you had not anticipated its mattering. Titus was not useful. He was not capable. He was not positioned anywhere in any hierarchy that Damian's formation had taught him to assess. He was simply there, with the complete and uncomplicated attachment that dogs offer to the people who care for them, and Damian received this attachment with something that was, if examined honestly, a form of relief, the specific relief of connection that required nothing in return, except the continuation of the care that had invited it. Other animals followed, because once the capacity had been discovered, it turned out to have considerable depth. The bat, the cat, the various creatures that Damian accumulated with the thoroughness he brought to everything were not collected but adopted, not acquired but accepted into a relationship of mutual obligation that the League had never sanctioned, and that the cave regarded with the mixture of mild exasperation and genuine recognition that Alfred's management of the situation. Most accurately expressed, Alfred provided for the animals with the same thoroughness he provided for everything, which was itself a form of endorsement. And Bruce observed their effect on Damian with the specific quality of attention that he brought to data points that complicated his existing model of a situation he thought he understood. The friendships that developed within the Batman family were slower to arrive and more contested in their development, because human beings were more complicated than animals in the specific ways that made the uncomplicated attachment more difficult to sustain. Other people had their own assessments, their own frameworks, their own responses to Damian that were not simply the unconditional attachment of a creature without the cognitive machinery for conditional attachment. Friendships with people required the negotiation of mutual regard across the difference of two complete subjectivities, which was precisely the kind of negotiation that the League had not trained Damian for, and that his default framework actively complicated. The developing relationship with Dick Grayson continued to operate even after Dick returned to Nightwing, because what Dick had installed in Damian during their partnership was not dependent on Dick's continued physical proximity for its maintenance. It had become part of Damian's operational repertoire, a way of being in relationship that he had now practiced enough to have some ability to reproduce without Dick's ongoing demonstration. He did not reproduce it perfectly or consistently, but the fact of its reproduction at all was itself significant, because it meant that the specific kind of relationship Dick had offered him had been internalized rather than simply received, had become something he was capable of rather than something that had happened to him. The friendships he developed with other young heroes were grudging and contested and real in the specific way that Damian's genuine relationships were always real, not warm in the register that warmth typically operated, but present with a quality of investment that was, for anyone paying attention, more revealing than warmth because it was less performed. He argued with people he had decided to regard as worth arguing with. He corrected people he had decided deserved accurate information rather than the comfortable inaccuracies that social grace sometimes required. He protected people with a thoroughness that exceeded what strict operational necessity required. in ways that could only be explained by the fact that their welfare mattered to him in some register beyond the purely tactical. The growing discomfort with killing was perhaps the most significant single development of this entire period, and it arrived not as a sudden conversion, but as the gradual accumulation of moments in which the internal cost of applying the League's logic outweighed the internal savings that the efficiency of that logic provided. The League had trained him to understand killing as a tool, the most final and therefore the most efficient resolution to certain categories of problem, deployable without the hesitation that the League regarded as weakness when it produced operational delays. This training had been effective in the immediate sense that it produced the capability without the natural human resistance that the capability would otherwise have encountered. But the training had been applied to a person who possessed, beneath the installation, the specific quality of moral seriousness that he had inherited from his father, and that could not be indefinitely redirected, without eventually producing the resistance that the training had been designed to prevent. The resistance came not as a philosophical position adopted through reasoning, but as a physical experience, a quality of internal cost that accumulated across the applications of the capability, each one leaving a deposit that the League's framework had no mechanism for processing, because the League's framework did not recognize the deposit as anything requiring processing. He carried the accumulation without understanding what it was, knowing only that it was there and that it increased. The specific moments that marked stages of his development would not have been recognizable as significant to anyone not already engaged in watching for them. The first time he chose a non-lethal resolution, not because the situation required it, but because something in him resisted the alternative. The first time he acknowledged, in terms that were not exactly an apology, but inhabited the space adjacent to one, that his assessment of a person had been wrong in ways that had caused harm he had not intended. The first time he offered comfort to a civilian in distress, and did so with something that was not entirely operational in its quality, something that suggested the comfort was offered because the distress mattered rather than because comforting it was the tactically appropriate response to the situation. Each of these moments passed without announcement. Damian did not flag them as significant. The formation that had produced him included the defense of treating its own revision as invisible, of allowing the development to occur below the threshold of the self-monitoring that might have introduced resistance to it. He was becoming something that he was not yet ready to acknowledge he was becoming, and the becoming proceeded at its own pace, governed by its own logic, following the trajectory that the sustained exposure to genuine care had established for it, and that nothing the League had installed had been entirely able to prevent. What the development revealed about the nature of formation and its limits was something that the League had always known in its most practically oriented moments, but had never formalized into explicit principle, because formalizing it would have required acknowledging a vulnerability in its own methods that the institution had significant reasons not to acknowledge. Formation was thorough, but not totalizing. It could shape the person it was applied to with extraordinary effectiveness in the directions it chose to shape them. It could install capabilities, frameworks, values, orientations, defaults of perception and response that would operate automatically in the absence of deliberate override. But it could not install the absence of the person being formed, could not eliminate the irreducible subjectivity that existed beneath every layer of institutional shaping, the genuine individual who was always there, even when buried so deep beneath the formation that their existence could be functionally ignored. Given the right sustained conditions specifically, given sustained exposure to genuine care from someone with sufficient patience to offer it consistently without demanding rapid results, and sufficient time for the care to accumulate into something that the person beneath the formation could use as a reference point for what the formation had denied them, the genuine individual could begin to make contact with the formation's surface, could begin introducing friction between what the formation prescribed and what the genuine individual found adequate to the experience of being alive. The friction would not be comfortable. It was not comfortable for Damian, who found the dissonance between his training and his developing interior life a persistent and sometimes acute source of difficulty that he managed through the mechanisms the League had given him for managing things that did not fit the framework by suppressing the acknowledgement of the dissonance while allowing it to operate in the directions that mattered. The specific contribution that Bruce Wayne's consistent presence made to this process was not the warmth that Dick had provided. Bruce was not capable of that specific contribution in the same degree, but something different that was its own form of essential. Bruce was, for Damian, proof that the moral seriousness that the League had attempted to redirect toward its own purposes could be directed elsewhere, could organize a life that was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely committed to the protection of the innocent and genuinely organized around values rather than around utility. He did not offer this proof explicitly or intentionally. He offered it by existing, by being, daily and in specific detail, the thing that Damian's formation had been trying to produce a directed version of, and that Damian was learning to understand as available in undirected form. The moral development that occurred across these years was not complete when Bruce Wayne's absence from the present created the period that would test everything that had been built. It was not even close to complete. It was a development that had begun, that was genuine, that was proceeding in directions that the League had not anticipated and that Damian himself had not fully mapped. But it was real, and its reality was the most significant thing about the person who would eventually be called to make the choice that the Batman Incorporated arc would require of him. The person who made that choice would not be the child the League had delivered to the cave. That child was still present, still operative in many of the formation's installed patterns and defaults. But something had grown alongside the formation that the formation had not planted and could not remove, something that, when the moment came that required it, would be available as the genuine ground of a genuine choice. He was still becoming. He would not stop becoming for a long time. But what he was becoming was, by the evidence accumulated across the years of his Robin tenure, something that neither the League nor Ra's al Ghul nor the most careful calculation of the possible products of two extraordinary bloodlines had quite anticipated, something that chose its own direction, something that was, in the deepest and most consequential sense available, his own. Batman Incorporated was Bruce Wayne's declaration that the identity he had built from personal catastrophe could be something larger than any single person's catastrophe, that the symbol, properly distributed and properly resourced, could operate across geographies and jurisdictions in ways that one man operating from one cave beneath one manor could never match. The philosophical ambition behind the initiative was genuine, and its practical architecture was impressive, and the specific way it ended for Damian Wayne was the most complete demonstration available of what it cost to distribute a symbol built from grief across a network of human beings who each became, through that distribution, a node in a network that sophisticated enemies could target with the same precision that sophisticated enemies always brought to the identification and exploitation of vulnerabilities in systems that presented themselves as strong. Talia's revelation as the head of Leviathan arrived in Damian's life, not as information received from outside, but as the collapse of a separation that had always been structural rather than genuine, the separation between the two worlds he had always carried within himself, the two inheritances that his formation had always contained in a tension that the League's framework had managed by designating one as primary and the other as context. His father's world and his mother's world had always existed simultaneously in him. They had been maintained as distinct because the people inhabiting them had maintained the distinction, had operated in opposition rather than direct confrontation, had conducted their conflict at scales and through methods that allowed Damian to exist in both without the existence, in both becoming existentially untenable. Leviathan ended this arrangement. The war between Batman Incorporated and Leviathan was not a war in which Damian could inhabit both sides simultaneously. could maintain the complicated loyalty that his complicated inheritance had allowed him to maintain across the years of his Robin tenure. It was a war in which the two worlds were in direct and violent contact with each other, in which every day of the conflict produced new evidence that the continuation of both was not an available option, that the specific form his life had taken since his arrival in Gotham required him to choose in a way that the years before the war had not required. He chose his father. He chose his father with the clarity of someone who had been arriving at this choice incrementally across the entire period of his development as Robin, and who recognized, when the moment of explicit choosing arrived, that the choice had already been made in the accumulation of every small decision he had made across the years, every moment when he had chosen the cave's values over the League's efficiency, every animal he had protected because its welfare mattered rather than because protecting it served a purpose, every time he had extended something toward another person that operated beyond the League's framework of capability and utility and the hierarchies those concepts produced. The choice was the most complete expression of his development that had yet occurred, and it cost him his mother in the specific and devastating way that genuine moral choices sometimes cost the relationships of the people who make them. Talia understood exactly what his choice meant. She was not a person who misread the situations she encountered, and she did not misread this one. She understood that the child she had produced to be the League's heir had chosen something other than the League's purposes, had become something other than what the League had made him, had arrived at a genuine self that was organized around values she had not installed and commitments she had not anticipated. Her response to this understanding was not simply the strategic response of someone whose plan had failed, but also the response of a mother who had lost something, who had lost the child she had thought she was keeping when she delivered him to his father, who had understood the delivery as temporary, as the provision of context that would eventually return him to her purposes, and who now understood that the delivery had been permanent in ways she had not intended. The heretic was the mechanism of Leviathan's response to Damian's choice. The clone grown from Damian's own DNA, accelerated to adulthood through the League's considerable resources, trained as the instrument that the original had failed to become. He was the most literal possible expression of what Talia had always maintained as a contingency, the acknowledgement built into the plan from the beginning that the genuine child might not produce the required outcome, and that a replacement, without the complicating variables of genuine development, should therefore be kept available. The heretic was Damian, without the formation's failure, without the months with Dick Grayson, without the animals, without the accumulated development across the years of his Robin tenure, without the genuine self that had grown alongside the League's installation and eventually made contact with it. He was also, in the most precise and most devastating way, a demonstration of what Damian had escaped. Looking at the heretic was looking at what the League had intended to produce, what it would have produced if the formation had been complete, if the genuine person beneath it had been more thoroughly suppressed, if the right sustained conditions had not been available to contest the installation. The heretic was the League's success, expressed in the form of the person standing across from Damian in the final confrontation, and the confrontation was therefore simultaneously a fight and the most extreme possible version of the question that Damian's entire life had been organized around answering the question of what a person made from these materials would choose to become. The fight was not equal. This fact requires acknowledgement without the softening that the legend sometimes applies to it. The heretic was physically larger, had been developed specifically as an instrument of combat, with none of the complications that genuine development introduces into a fighter's relationship with violence. And Damian was fighting someone built from his own biological template, but without the internal resistance that his development had installed. The League had made the heretic to win this specific fight against this specific opponent, and the making had been thorough. Damian fought anyway. He fought with everything his formation had given him, and everything his development had added to it, which was considerable, and which was, in the end, insufficient. He fought with the knowledge of what he was fighting for, not just for his own survival, which the League's training had always made a primary consideration, but for something that the League's training had not quite installed, and that his development had for the people behind him, for the mission he had chosen, for the values he had arrived at through the long process of becoming someone who had values in the genuine sense, rather than frameworks that served an institution's purposes. He died in that fight. The sentence has a simplicity that the event did not have, and the simplicity is in some ways a betrayal of the event, but the event also requires the simplicity. It was complete. It was not ambiguous. It was the ending of a specific life that had been remarkable and still incomplete, that had been moving towards something that its ending prevented it from reaching. He died having made the choice that his entire development had been preparing him to make, having expressed in the most costly possible form the moral commitment that the League had tried to redirect and that had, in the end, refused to be redirected. The specific grief that Bruce Wayne experienced in the aftermath was the grief of someone for whom loss was not a new experience, and who had therefore accumulated, across the years of the losses, a significant repository of experience with the specific weight of significant loss, and who discovered, in the death of his son, that this repository provided less protection than its accumulation might have suggested it would. He had lost before. He had lost parents and partners, and the closest approximations of friends that his formation had allowed him to maintain. He had processed each loss through the mechanisms the cave had developed for processing things that could not be operationally managed, which was to say, imperfectly and with significant residue that the processing left behind rather than resolved. The loss of Damian was different in kind from the losses that had preceded it in his experience, because it was the loss of someone in whom he had been engaged in a project of genuine mutual discovery, the imperfect, costly, genuinely progressing project of learning what it meant to be father and son under the specific, impossible conditions the cave had provided for the attempt. Every other significant loss had been the loss of someone he had known in the form they had arrived in. Damian's loss was the loss of someone he had been in the process of knowing, which meant the loss was also the loss of everything that the knowing would have eventually produced, the relationship that was becoming something and that had been interrupted before the becoming reached any point that could be called completion. He had not been a perfect father. The honest account of his fatherhood acknowledged this directly, and without the softening that grief sometimes applied to assessments of relationships ended by death. He had been capable and protective and genuinely invested, and also characteristically unable to offer the forms of presence and warmth that a different kind of person might have offered more naturally, and the combination had produced a relationship that was real and imperfect, and exactly as incomplete as the years available to it had allowed it to be. He mourned all of it, the relationship as it had been, imperfect and real, and the relationship as it might eventually have become, if becoming had been available to it. The 24 children who constituted Damian's primary peer relationships mourned differently, with the specific quality of grief that young people bring to the loss of someone they have fought, alongside grief that is inseparable from the memory of the fighting. That carries within it the specific texture of the person in action, the particular capabilities and particular qualities that express themselves most fully in the shared circumstances of the work. They had known Damian in the cave and in the field, and in the specific compressed social world that the Batman family constituted. And what they had known was someone who was difficult and capable and genuine in ways that the difficulty sometimes concealed but did not eliminate. The death of Robin had a quality that deaths of people still in the process of becoming always have, the quality of incompleteness that is different from the incompleteness of any death, because it is not simply the incompleteness of a life cut short, but the incompleteness of a specific trajectory interrupted. Damian Wayne had been on his way to something. The something had been visible in the accumulation of his development, had been legible to anyone who had been paying attention across the years of his Robin tenure, had been the most significant product of everything that the cave and Dick Grayson and the animals and the grudging, genuine friendships and the slow, imperfect relationship with his father had combined to produce in him. The death interrupted the trajectory. What it did not do, what death cannot do to a person whose development has already produced things that exist in the world outside themselves, was eliminate what had already been produced. The choice Damian had made in the final confrontation existed. The development that had made the choice possible existed in everyone who had witnessed it and been changed by the witnessing. The specific person he had been in the process of becoming had, in the act of choosing his father's world over his mother's purposes, expressed itself completely enough that its nature was no longer unknown, was, in fact, more completely known in the final act than it had been in any of the preceding ones he had chosen. Against the formation, against the contingency that had been prepared for his failure to choose correctly, against the mother whose love for him was real and whose agenda for him was incompatible with the person he had become, he had chosen. And the choice had been fully his, produced by a self that was genuinely his own, organized around values that he had arrived at, rather than values that had been installed in him, expressed at the cost that genuine choices sometimes require when the world is arranged in ways that make genuine choices costly. This was the person the League had failed to fully make. This was the person the cave had helped to find. This was Damian Wayne, who had been born into a story that was not his, and had died in the act of insisting that the story could be. There is a particular form of grief that belongs to parents who have lost children, and it is distinguished from other forms of grief, not by its intensity alone, though intensity is present, but by its specific quality of wrongness, its refusal to accept the frame that grief normally provides for the processing of loss. Ordinary grief, if grief can ever be called ordinary, operates within a framework that acknowledges the inevitability of endings, that draws on the accumulated human understanding that lives conclude, and that the conclusion, however painful, is the shape that lives have always had. The grief of a parent for a child does not have access to this framework, or cannot use it, because the framework depends on an acceptance of the natural order of things, and there is nothing natural in any register that the grieving parent can inhabit about a child dying before the parent who produced them. Bruce Wayne had built his entire existence around the grief of a child for parents. He had converted that grief into purpose, into architecture, into the cave and the cowl and the decades of the mission that had consumed everything the mission required of him. He understood grief from the inside in ways that most people did not, had been carrying a specific grief for longer than most people lived, had developed around that grief the elaborate structure of everything he had become. He did not understand, until the specific form of loss that Damian's death presented to him, what it was to grieve in the direction that grief was not supposed to travel, not backward toward what had been taken, but forward toward what would never now occur. His response to Damian's death was not the paralysis that grief sometimes produced in people who had not learned, across long experience with significant loss, to continue functioning through it. He functioned. The cave continued its operations. The mission continued its prosecution of the purposes it had always prosecuted. The surface of Bruce Wayne's existence maintained itself with the efficiency that decades of maintaining surfaces through internal states that would have been visible on less practiced faces had made possible. Beneath the surface, something was occurring that the surface concealed, but did not resolve the specific processing of a loss too large for the cave's mechanisms to address within the time frame the cave's operations required, which produced the particular quality of grief that operates at a remove from consciousness, doing its work in the hours not claimed by the work the mission required. He could not accept it. This is not the same statement as saying he refused to accept it, which would suggest a choice made against available options, a decision to persist in denial, when acceptance was possible. He simply could not, because acceptance required the finality that the frame of Damian's death did not, on examination, actually provide. His son had died. The world that had produced his son contained mechanisms for reversing death that Bruce Wayne knew about in specific detail, because those mechanisms had intersected with his own history in ways that gave him more than theoretical knowledge of their existence and their operation. The Lazarus Pits existed. They had restored Ra's al Ghul across centuries of use, had produced the extended lifespan that made Ra's what he was, had been the means by which the League maintained its most essential asset. They could, in the right circumstances and with the right access, restore what death had taken. The journey Bruce Wayne undertook in search of a means to bring his son back was not the journey of a man acting from pure grief without rational assessment of the available options. It was the journey of someone who had assessed the options with the thoroughness he brought to every significant operational challenge, and had concluded that the option existed, and that pursuing it was the appropriate response to the situation. It was also, and he was not unaware of this, the journey of a man whose grief had made rational assessment more difficult than his ordinary standards required, who was making choices in the context of a loss that compromised the emotional neutrality that his best thinking required. He pursued the resurrection anyway, because the alternative was accepting a permanence that he had concluded was not actually permanent, and accepting a false permanence seemed worse than pursuing a difficult truth. What the pursuit required of him was not simple. The mechanisms that could reverse Damian's death were not mechanisms available through ordinary channels, were not accessible through the resources and relationships that his ordinary operational infrastructure could reach. They were mechanisms belonging to a world that he had always maintained some relationship with through his history with Ra's al Ghul and Talia, and that relationship was now organized by the fact that the people who controlled the most relevant mechanisms were the people whose war had produced the death he was trying to reverse. The navigation of this territory required compromises that his ordinary operating principles found uncomfortable, and that his grief made him willing to accept in ways that his ordinary operating principles might not have. Ra's al Ghul's involvement in the situation was its own complexity. The grandfather, who had designed Damian's existence as an instrument of succession, who had maintained a possessive relationship with the child from a distance across the years of his development, who had never been given the access. He had always considered his due. He had his own interest in Damian's resurrection that was not identical to Bruce Wayne's interest, and that operated according to its own logic in the same situation. Ra's wanted Damian restored, but Raz's wanting was not the wanting of a grandfather who loved his grandson, or not primarily. It was the wanting of someone who had invested centuries of planning in a specific outcome, and who had watched that outcome interrupted before it could be achieved, who viewed the death as a disruption to a project rather than as a tragedy to be mourned. The tension between these two versions of wanting Bruce Wayne's grief-driven urgency and Ra's al Ghul's agenda-driven interest produced a navigation of the resurrection process that was neither straightforward cooperation nor straightforward conflict, but the specific, complicated territory between them, in which two parties, with convergent, immediate desires and incompatible underlying purposes, attempted to pursue the convergent desire without providing the other party more than absolutely necessary toward their incompatible purpose. Bruce was aware that Raz's assistance in the resurrection was not assistance freely given, but assistance extended as one element of a transaction whose other terms remained to be fully established. He accepted this awareness and its implications as the cost of what the process required, because the cost was acceptable and the alternative was not. Damian returned. The return was not a simple reversal of the death, not the restoration of the person who had died to the condition from which the death had departed. Resurrection, through the mechanisms available to it in the world that Damian and Bruce Wayne inhabited, was not a neutral process. It was an intervention that left traces, that produced changes whose full scope was not always immediately legible, that returned the person while potentially altering specific aspects of what the return produced. Damian came back, changed in ways that required time to fully understand, carrying his death as a new piece of knowledge about himself and the world, returned to a life that had processed his absence in its own way, and that his presence now disrupted in the specific way that returns from the believed permanent always disrupted the arrangements made around an accepted absence. The world he came back to was not identical to the world he had left. The people who had known him had moved, in the months of his absence, in directions that the absence had made available to them, had processed their grief, had reorganized their understanding of what his life had meant, had begun the slow construction of a relationship with his memory that was different in kind from a relationship with his continued presence. His return required the dismantling of some of this. The grief that had been processed had to be unprocessed. The absence that had been accepted had to be unaccepted. The permanent thing had to be revealed as having been temporary after all, which was not simply a relief, but also, in ways that took time to fully register, a disruption of the psychological work that the acceptance of permanence had permitted. Bruce Wayne's response to the return contained the specific quality of someone for whom an unbearable thing had been reversed, and who found themselves uncertain about what the reversal entitled them to feel relief. Obviously, relief that was profound and immediate, and organized around the simple fact of his son's continued existence in the world. But also the more complicated awareness that the return did not restore everything the death had taken, that the specific relationship they had been in the process of building when the death interrupted it could not simply resume from the point of interruption, but would have to recommence from wherever both of them currently were, which was not where they had been. Damian's own experience of the return was the experience of someone navigating a profound discontinuity. The gap between the person who had died and the person who returned contained the pant. Death itself contained the experience of whatever the dying and the being dead had been, contained all the time that had passed in a world that had continued without him. He was continuous with the person who had died in the most important sense, in the values, the genuine self, the moral commitments that had expressed themselves most completely in the choice that had preceded the death, and was also, in less important but still real ways, altered by the experience of discontinuity in ways that required new accommodation. The specific changes that death and return had produced in him were not simply the physical adjustments that the resurrection process involved, but something more interior, a relationship with his own mortality that was different from the relationship he had carried before the death, both more intimate and in some ways more peaceful. The League had trained him to operate in the proximity of death, without the distraction of excessive concern about his own survival, had made the management of mortality into a capability rather than a fear. This training had not fully prepared him for the encounter with his own death that the death had been, and the return had not erased the encounter but had added to it the knowledge of what came after the knowledge, available now in a form more direct than any training could provide, that death was not the absolute end. The League had always treated it as operationally irrelevant, but that it was something he had experienced and survived, something that was now part of his history in the most complete possible sense. He was different. The difference was real, and it was also, in the ways that mattered most, not a departure from who he had been becoming, but a continuation of it, the same trajectory, proceeding now from a point further along it than anyone had expected to reach, carrying the experience of death as a new element in the formation of a self that had always been in the process of being formed rather than being a fixed thing. He had died choosing his father's world. He returned to continue inhabiting it, knowing now, in a way that only the experience of the alternative could provide, that the choice had been right, that the person who had made it had been the genuine person rather than the League's product, that the self that had expressed itself in the final act was the self that persisted and that the return permitted to continue. The world received him back with the specific mixture of relief and readjustment that significant returns always required. He was alive, he was present, he was, in the ways that the continuing assessment of those who knew him best could determine, genuinely himself, the self that had been developing across the years of his Robin tenure, the self that had made the choice the heretic confrontation had required, the self that the return had restored to a life that had work still to do and a trajectory still to follow toward whatever it was in the process of becoming. He had died and returned, and the return did not erase the dying, but incorporated it, made it part of the history of a person who was still in the process of becoming fully that person, who had survived everything his origins had required him to survive, and had arrived, again, at the ongoing project of being Damian Wayne in a world that had never quite prepared for what Damian Wayne actually was. There is a question about Damian Wayne that the legend of his origins tends to obscure by making his story primarily about where he came from, about the bloodlines and the formation and the institution that made him into what he arrived as. The question that his ongoing story insists on instead is simpler and in some ways more fundamental. What does a person do with what they have been given, when what they have been given includes both extraordinary capability and the specific freedom, hard-won and costly, to direct that capability according to their own genuine values, rather than the values of whoever made them capable, he continued. This is the essential fact of his ongoing story, and it is a fact whose significance is easy to underestimate, because continuation sounds like a passive thing, sounds like the mere persistence of existence, when in Damian Wayne's specific case continuation was the active and deliberate ongoing choice to be the person who had made the choice in the heretic confrontation, rather than to retreat. In the aftermath of death and return, and the profound disruption that both had produced, into something easier or more familiar, the League's formation remained in him, would always remain in him in some form, because formation that thorough applied that early does not disappear, but becomes part of the substrate on which everything subsequent is built. He continued to be exceptional in the ways the League had made him exceptional. He continued also to be, with increasing stability and decreasing contestation from the installation, genuinely himself. The relationships with other young heroes that developed across the years following his return were the most visible evidence of this ongoing development, because they were the contexts in which the distance between what the League had made him and what he was becoming expressed itself most clearly through contrast. The League had produced someone who assessed other people through the framework of hierarchy and capability, who regarded the question of relationship primarily as the question of relative position in an ordering determined by demonstrated excellence, who found the horizontal forms of connection, friendship, partnership, mutual regard between equals more conceptually difficult than the vertical ones. The League's framework had primarily prepared him for. What he encountered in the community of young heroes who inhabited his world was a context organized around exactly those horizontal forms, and his navigation of that context reflected both his continuing difficulty with it and his genuine investment in developing the capacity it required. He was still difficult. The assessor's eye had not been trained out of him, and would not be. It was too thoroughly installed, and also too genuinely useful in the operational contexts that his life regularly produced, for its elimination to be either achievable or desirable. But the assessment had developed a quality it had not possessed in his early days, a quality of interest that was not purely evaluative but something closer to curiosity, an attention to other people that contained within it the genuine desire to understand them, rather than simply to position them. The friendships he maintained were maintained with the specific quality of investment that characterized his genuine engagements intensely, with the thoroughness he brought to everything he committed to, with a loyalty that, once established, operated at the absolute level that the League had established as the only level at which significant things were worth operating. He was not an easy friend. He was a friend who would tell you what he actually thought, regardless of whether what he actually thought was comfortable, who would correct your errors with a directness that bypassed the social smoothing that most people applied to such corrections, who would protect you from genuine threats with a completeness that exceeded what any reasonable assessment of obligation required. He was also, and this was the development that his early days in the cave would have made difficult to predict, a friend who had learned to receive care, who had developed, through the long process of the years since his arrival, sufficient trust in the genuine quality of the regard offered by specific people to allow that regard to reach him without the defensive management that his formation had initially made automatic. The capacity that the animals had first opened in him had extended, gradually and incompletely but genuinely, to the humans whose consistent quality of care had established them as safe recipients of his own genuine response. He loved the people he loved in the specific way that people who have learned to love against the resistance of their own formation love, with a fierceness that was partly the love itself and partly the knowledge of what it had cost to arrive at the capacity for it. The question of what Damian Wayne would eventually become, whether his trajectory pointed toward his own iteration of the Batman identity, towards something continuous with it but distinct, towards something that neither of his parents had anticipated when they had produced him as an instrument, and a successor, remained genuinely open in the way that questions about people, still in the process of becoming, always remain open. The indicators were present for multiple readings. He possessed the capability that the Batman identity required in full measure, had demonstrated across the years of his Robin tenure a quality of commitment to the protection of the innocent that was not simply the performance of an institutional value, but the expression of something genuinely his own. He had also demonstrated, in the ways that his particular formation and his particular development had combined to produce, qualities that would make his version of the identity distinct from any previous iteration, more direct, less patient with the specific forms of calculation that Bruce Wayne's psychology required, more willing to acknowledge the emotional stakes of the work in ways that the cave had taught as vulnerabilities, but that Damian's experience had taught as information. What he revealed about the nature of inheritance was the thing that made his story matter beyond the specific circumstances of his specific life. The conventional understanding of inheritance tends toward the deterministic, we are what we come from, we carry forward what was given to us. The formation of the beginning governs the trajectory of everything subsequent. This understanding is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and Damian Wayne was the most precise available demonstration of its incompleteness. He had come from two extraordinary bloodlines, and from the most sophisticated institutional formation that either of those bloodlines had been able to apply to him. He had been given, before he could consent to or resist the giving, an extraordinary set of capabilities, and an extraordinary set of values, and an extraordinary set of purposes that the people who gave them had believed would govern everything he subsequently became. They had governed a great deal. They continued to govern a great deal, but they had not governed everything, had not been able to govern the genuine person who existed beneath and alongside the formation, who had proven to be not simply the product of what had been given, but the subject of it, someone to whom things had been done, rather than simply something that had been made, someone whose genuine selfhood persisted through the formation, rather than being eliminated by it, someone who had eventually, given the right conditions, been able to bring that genuine selfhood into sufficient contact with the formation's surface to begin the process of revision that had produced the person he currently was. The specific contribution his existence made to the mythology of Batman was the contribution that could only be made by someone who had arrived from outside the mythology and been incorporated into it, the contribution of a perspective that had known what the mythology looked like from the position of its opposition, and could therefore illuminate, through that external knowledge, aspects of the mythology that internal familiarity had made invisible. He knew what Ra's al Ghul knew about what Batman was, and why it mattered, and what made it both admirable and insufficient. He knew what Talia knew about the specific quality of Bruce Wayne's extraordinary commitment and the specific costs of that commitment to everyone who came near enough to be shaped by it. He had been given, by the particular circumstances of his origin, a comprehensive education in both the strengths and the limitations of the identity he had eventually chosen, and what he brought to the choosing was not the unreflective commitment that initial formation sometimes produced, but something harder won, and therefore more genuinely his own, he was still becoming. The recognition of this fact was itself a product of his development. The League had not trained him to understand himself as something in process, had presented the formation as a completion rather than a beginning, had produced in him the certainty of someone who had arrived at a fixed and final version of themselves, rather than the awareness of someone still in motion. The years had revised this. He understood himself now as someone whose trajectory was not determined, whose genuine self was not a thing achieved and possessed, but an ongoing project of development, whose next stages were not fully predictable from its current position. This understanding was not comfortable in the way that certainty was comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty was a value that his development had established as one of the genuine ones, not installed by the League, but arrived at through the specific experience of learning what it cost to lack it, the father and son they were to each other. In the ongoing, imperfect development of that relationship across the years that followed the death and the return, continued the project. They had always been engaged in the project of learning each other across the enormous distance of their respective formations, of finding in each other the qualities that their shared inheritance had given them, without the shared experience of growing up that ordinarily made the recognition of shared qualities in family members feel natural rather than discovered. They argued, they worked together. They maintained between them the specific tension of two people who were alike in ways that made the differences more rather than less significant, who recognized in each other what they each most struggled to accept about themselves, and whose relationship therefore operated as a mirror that neither of them could look away from without cost. The world Damian Wayne inhabited was still the world that the League's formation and the Cave's revision had between them produced him for, still a world that required the specific combination of extraordinary capability and genuine moral commitment that his particular history had made available to him in its particular form. He moved through it as someone who knew its full complexity from the inside, in ways that most of its inhabitants did not, who knew what it looked like from Ra's al Ghul's long perspective, and from Bruce Wayne's grief-organized dedication, and from the specific position of someone who had been made as a weapon and had chosen to be a person instead. He had chosen. He continued choosing. The choosing was the ongoing form of the development that had begun before he was capable of understanding it as development, and it would continue for as long as he continued, which was, if the trajectory held and the genuine self that had emerged through and alongside the formation continued to govern the direction of that trajectory. For a very long time, he was the son of Batman. He was also, which was the thing the League had produced him to prevent, and the Cave had helped him to become, genuinely himself, and these two facts coexisted in him, not as a contradiction, but as the precise form of his inheritance, chosen and owned and directed according to the values he had arrived at through the longest and most costly development that any child in the history of extraordinary families had been required to undertake. And so ends our long journey through the story of Damian Wayne, not with a conclusion, because a person still becoming does not conclude, but with the recognition that becoming itself is the most honest ending available. Rest now, fellow wanderer of the shadow between worlds. Let the cave's darkness settle around you the way darkness settles when it is familiar rather than threatening, when it contains not danger, but the quiet patience of something old and watchful and ultimately kind. Let the weight of inheritance set itself aside for these hours, the inheritances you chose and the ones you did not, the formations given before consent was possible, and the revisions achieved at cost. We are, all of us, made by forces we did not select, shaped before we were capable of resisting the shaping, given purposes and frameworks and values by people whose love for us was real and whose vision of what we should become was incomplete. This is not tragedy. This is the condition of being born into a world already in progress. What Damian Wayne teaches is simply this, that the genuine self persists, that it can be found, that finding it is worth everything it costs. Sleep now. You are still becoming. So is everyone.